Hello, I'm Joe, and y'all, I miss 3D movies. Throughout the mid-2000s, 3D was quietly making a comeback, mostly through animated flicks like Chicken Little, Meet the Robinsons, and Beowulf. Man, that is 2 videos in a row with Beowulf references. It's gotta be a sign. When it came to live action movies, 3D was mostly used for movies shown in IMAX and were usually only for a few scenes. I remember seeing Superman Returns in IMAX 3D, and there'd be moments where like little glasses would come on the bottom corner, you put the glasses on, you watch the plane sequence, and like Superman lifting the freaking continent. Weird that movie was in 3D considering like not much happened. And honestly, the Superman Returns approach was indicative to just how it was really handled in most live action movies. Just kind of there. And obviously this would change in 2009 with the release of James Cameron's Avatar. Nowadays, it's in vogue to hate on the first Avatar, and in my 20s, I was one of those. But as a teenager, Avatar was mind-blowing. The immersive 3D combined with the hyper-real effects created a truly unique sensory experience. Honestly, I think a good chunk of the Avatar hate comes from the fact that its core selling point can't be replicated at home. Personally, I still find the first Avatar to be a technical marvel and most importantly, a fun movie. You can call it Space Pocahontas all you want, but it's no more derivative than the majority of the film's audiences happily lap up. Avatar made an ungodly amount of money, becoming the highest grossing film of all time, largely because of its visual splendor and the revolutionary approach to 3D. Well, most 3D films up to that point only had a few moments that made you go, oh wow, 3D! The entirety of Avatar was designed to evoke that feeling. Watching it at home, you can definitely tell that many of the shots were designed to be experienced in three-dimensional space. To put it plainly, they thought about the 3D. Unfortunately, Hollywood is a town built on learning the wrong lessons. So with Avatar, the lesson wasn't be intentional about 3D, it was, yo, with this 3D shit, we could add an extra $3 to every ticket. The bellwether for what was to come would arrive in April 2010 with the release of Clash of the Titans. Now, Clash of the Titans was a film shot and edited for 3D. After the mammoth success of Avatar, Warner's pressured director Louis Leterrier into converting the film into 3D only 4 months before it was set to release. When Clash of the Titans hit theaters in April 2010, one of the biggest criticisms was how bad the 3D looked. And like, yeah, they were only given 4 months to convert a movie, not even shot for 3D. Throughout 2010, there were quite a few really bad 3D rush jobs, The Last Airbender being most notable. Aside from just being an awful film, it was also a visual mess in 3D. I didn't pay to see this one in 3D, but I was working at the movie theater at the time and like snuck in during a screening with some glasses and was like, wow, how is this even more ass? That said, 2010 wasn't all bad. A 3D banger would come from one of the most unlikely places with Jackass 3D. Leave it to the Jackass guys to have one of the most playful, brilliant, revolting, and just outright effective uses of the format. It genuinely stands as like one of the greatest 3D movies in my opinion because of the reckless abandon of which Jeff Tremaine and that whole crew went about it. And the December following Avatar would have yet another dope 3D sci-fi visual marvel in Tron Legacy. And Tron was another film that took a more thoughtful approach to 3D. When in the real world, the movie was 2D, but when Sam hits the grid, the 3D and IMAX shots come into play. I saw Tron way too many times in theaters. Like I said, I worked in a movie theater, so quite a few of those showings were free, but I paid for every single one of those IMAX showings. The reason I kept going back is because it was an experience I couldn't replicate at home. 3D TVs were prohibitively expensive for my broke collegiate ass, and they never gained enough market share to go down in price. If I wanted to experience a movie like Tron in its ideal format, I had to get my ass into theaters while it was still there. Throughout the early 2010s, 3D was a steady presence in theaters, and for a brief time, theaters would prioritize 3D screenings over regular vision because the demand was actually there. Yet, as the decade wound to a close, 3D became more of a niche. So what happened there? Well, the answer is twofold. 3D went away because studios overexploited the format without offering anything meaningful, and secondly, filmmakers were criminally uncurious about the technology. So let's look at the first part of this answer. Most of the bad 3D conversions were front-loaded into 2010 as studios rushed to ride the Avatar wave. I would consider 2011 to 2012 basically like the peak of 3D films. We had movies like Hugo, Life of Pi, The Adventures of Tintin, Transformers Dark of the Moon, and Dread. In the case of Hugo and Life of Pi and Tintin, they used the format in ways that were thoughtful and enhanced the stories being told. It really was a storytelling tool. With Transformers and Dread, it just looked freaking awesome, man. Like, it took the spectacle being delivered and cranked it to 11. Now, a fun fact about me, I'm a staunch Transformers 3 defender. I think that movie is actually pretty good. Expect a video on that sometime. The reason I like it so much is I think that the use of 3D required Michael Bay to slow his style down, resulting in the most visually coherent film in the franchise and perhaps his entire filmography. Yet, it'd be around 2013 where it really felt like folks were starting to tire of the format. Upon memory and some research, Gravity was really the only 3D banger of the year. It wasn't the only movie released in 3D, but it was the only one that really did something interesting with the format. Cuarón's observational style blended with the zero-gravity disaster made for a thrilling 3D adventure, not to mention the stunning use of Dolby Atmos sound. This was a true cinematic experience. And unfortunately, this was really the pattern during 3D's twilight days. There'd be one really good example of the format, and then a bunch of just forgettable nonsense. Outside of the bangers, bad conversions had evolved into movies that just didn't really do anything with 3D. Movies would be converted in 3D just to get that surcharge, but it'd become abundantly clear that the movie you're watching wasn't really designed for the format. The cute line often used at the time was, "We really wanted to add more depth to the frame." And that's valid. Both Avatar films did that well. But that wasn't what everyone else was doing, though. As someone who watched a lot of 3D movies because I could see them for free, you could feel the difference between movies that were intended to be seen in 3D and the ones that were converted just to inflate ticket prices. When it came to mid-tier 3D, the experience would generally be that for the first few frames, you're like, oh snap, 3D. But eventually your eyes would adjust and there's nothing in the frame, the camera movement, or action that's meaningfully interacting with the format. So it didn't feel like you were watching a 3D movie. It felt exactly like what it was, a 2D movie upscaled to 3D. Now, to be fair, some of these conversions were actually quite fantastic. Simply being shot in 2D doesn't mean it couldn't be a good 3D movie. The re-releases of The Phantom Menace and Titanic were movies that actually felt like 3D added something to the experience. While 3D clearly wasn't on the forefront of George Lucas or James Cameron's mind while they made their films in the 90s, you could tell a lot of time, energy, and resources were put into making sure the 3D conversions felt like they actually added something to the films as opposed to just feeling like a way to get a bunch more money. But again, those are the exceptions, not the rule. Unless you're talking about animated films. Because, y'all, animated films in 3D? Oh my god, y'all. I'm talking Kung Fu Panda 2 and 3, Legends of the Guardians, Rise of the Guardians, the Spider-Verse films. I could really keep going on. It's a long list. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like I completely understand the actual technical reasons for why animation is more suited to 3D, but I will say it's consistently a more rewarding sensory experience. An animated film doesn't have to worry about working within the bounds of reality, so there's an array of techniques and possibilities unique to the medium that truly come to life in 3D. When I think of movies that make me go, yo, that's damn good 3D, it's obviously the Avatars, Gravity, Tron, but it's mostly animated films outside of that. So as the 10s went on, 3D became less and less common. The last true 3D tentpole experience of the initial surge was the Hobbit trilogy, when Peter Jackson experimented not just with 3D, but also high frame rate to not great results. I remember seeing An Unexpected Journey in HFR with my buddy Oscar, and both of us feeling like we were watching a movie on fast forward. Now, this may not have been the case for all theaters, but I know at the one I worked at, the 3D showings were predominantly for HFR. So by the time Desolation of Smog came around, folks opted for the 2D because the HFR made such a poor first impression. I saw both films in HFR and thought that Smog, in many ways, was an improvement over An Unexpected Journey, but the HFR still wasn't quite there. The final Hobbit film came out in 2014, and after that, the 3D craze quietly faded away. The box office gains became negligible, and eventually 3D screenings became limited to 1 or 2 showings a day for a new film. By 2017, IMAX began defaulting to 2D screenings because their data showed audiences clearly preferred them. And in the years since this peak, there have been a few solid 3D flicks here and there. Alita Battle Angel, the Guardians flicks, and while it wasn't good, Gemini Man was the most technologically impressive dad movie I have ever seen in my life. At times the HFR made it look like a display TV at a Best Buy, but the long takes on the fight scenes did make me go, damn, okay. So yes, lazy conversions and some not quite there technological advancements resulted in 3D feeling like a downgrade from the 2D experience, but there are 2 sides to this coin. The reason there were so many 3D stinkers isn't just because these unnecessary conversions, but also because there were so few filmmakers really trying to explore the format. It may seem comical now, but the rise of 3D was actually pretty controversial in its initial years, and it led to some serious soul-searching and conversations about what the future of cinema looked like. Filmmakers were genuinely scared, and not without reason. Everyone was chasing the success of Avatar, no matter the cost. If the success of Avatar could be repeatable consistently, there was worry that movies would have to be in 3D. There'd be no other way to make them. And it really didn't help matters that unless you were Christopher Nolan, studios basically took the choice away from filmmakers and converted them anyway. Essentially a compromise of, look, you get to make your movie, we're not going to tell you how to shoot it, but we're still going to convert it anyway just to, get that $3 surcharge. And I totally get why that way of going about things would just turn anyone off from wanting to actively engage with the format. It wasn't uncommon to see high-profile directors being critical of 3D in interviews, which I get, but also, shouldn't we be excited about new technology? I get that studios saw it as just a way to mine extra money from their movies, but the filmmakers didn't have to see it that way. It didn't have to be that. This was a tool that could have enhanced and opened new storytelling techniques, and it saddens me that a generation of filmmakers held onto tradition so firmly that a potentially cool thing was killed out of fear of it replacing the old. And it's fascinating because while the young bucks of the time were staunchly against it, when some of the older, more seasoned filmmakers who had the choice on whether or not to make a 3D movie chose to do so, you could really see the potential. When Cuarón, Spielberg, Scorsese, Lerman, Cameron, and Zemeckis took a stab at it, they all crafted unique, thrilling takes that showcased different potential strengths of the format. In Hugo, Gravity, and The Walk, the 3D worked in tandem with the narrative and crafted unique, unfortunately ephemeral experiences. They used the massive budgets they were allotted to experiment with new technology and use 3D not as a gimmick, but an actual tool to enhance the stories being told. And I really wish more filmmakers took this route. There seemed to be a feeling that, well, it's gonna be in 3D anyway, so why bother? And instead of actively engaging with the tool, they just ignored it. I feel like if more filmmakers were given the choice instead of these conversions just being forced on them, we probably would have seen a higher hit rate for 3D movies. When every movie is converted to 3D, regardless if it was considered during the filmmaking process, it was inevitable that it was going to lead to diminishing returns. If 3D was used sparingly in movies that were actively designed for the format, eventizing it essentially, Avatar's success probably would have been replicated far sooner. And listen, I know making a movie is hard. I'm working to get my first feature off the ground and that shit is stressful. But when it comes to big budget spectacle, if it's already gonna be made in 3D, I just don't see why you wouldn't at least have some curiosity or desire to play with this new storytelling tool, especially when at its best you can see the potential. And even more so because the studio was already paying for it. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, why am I bringing all this up now? Well, 2023 was a very bad, no good, downright terrible year for the business of film. Outside of Guardians, Spider-Verse, and Barbenheimer, most of the surefire hits failed and lost a lot of money. The strikes have caused a ripple effect that will likely be felt over the next couple of years, and the economics of streaming have put quite a few studios on the back foot. It was a sad yet frustratingly self-inflicted turn of events by studio heads making baffling decisions. It was a stunning turn of events given the box office rally of 2022 led by Avatar: Way of Water and Top Gun: Maverick. And quite honestly, The Way of Water had more going against it than its predecessor. There was the perceived lack of cultural impact from the first film, which I found was greatly overstated. When I talk to people who just like movies and don't make it their whole personality, they like Avatar. Don't love it, but it generally came on TV during Christmas, during the 10s, and I think people just got in the habit of, hey, Avatar's on, I'll watch it. I was dating an outright baddie at the end of 2019, which I obviously fumbled, and I distinctly remember going to a Christmas party with her family and Avatar being on the TV, and people would linger around the TV. And I was one of those people. And the other perceived headwind against Way of Water is the death of 3D. The biggest selling point of the first film, the trend it had helped launch, had pretty much died. But if Titanic and Avatar didn't prove it, The Way of Water showed you just never bet against Cameron. The man knows what the heck he's doing. Avatar: The Way of Water not only became the highest grossing movie of 2022, but the third highest grossing movie of all time in striking distance of Endgame, and I totally got it. I saw it, I want to say 3 or 4 times in theaters, because it did the one thing that I have been desperate for movies to do again. It consistently made me ask, oh my god, how did they do that? It made me believe in movie magic again. The Way of Water was a technical marvel with a strong emotional heart and some genuinely cool world building. The way I described it to my skeptical buddies is that Avatar was the prologue and Way of Water is where the story really gets going. Essentially, Avatar is the bridge arc and Way of Water is the tutoring exams. I also thought that 3D had been run into the ground, but Way of Water just completely blew open the further potential of the format. In IMAX 3D, Cameron employed a variable frame rate, and it actually worked. The fast forward feeling from The Hobbit is gone, replaced with a distinct sense of hyper-realism. While I'm generally not a fan of CGI worlds when they're rendered so beautifully and so believable as they are in Way of Water, I can get down with it. It achieved what damn near every big budget spectacle has strived for and failed at: seamless immersion. I struggled to figure out what was real and what was computer generated outside the Na'vi and creatures, obviously. As we head into 2024, there is an existential need for both studios and exhibitors to get audiences back into the theaters, because as I explained in the home media video, theaters have become the only place where studios can actively recoup the money they spend on stories. 3D, if used correctly, could be the thing to get asses back into seats. As we've seen, audiences didn't give up on 3D because of a lack of interest, but due to a lack of effort from both the studios and filmmakers pushing these movies out. The massive success of The Way of Water will show that if you deliver something that audiences can't get at home, they will show up. The lack of 3D in the home media space is actually a boon for theaters. It's the one experience audiences can't objectively replicate at home. If 3D becomes a viable choice for filmmakers to explore and not a mandatory conversion, it can make event films feel like, events again. Spectacles that push the boundaries of technology and demand to be seen on the biggest screen possible. If you're not gonna give me a story on the caliber of Everything Everywhere All at Once, Barbie, or Past Lives, the least you can do is put those mega budgets to use by pushing the technological boundaries in ways that are actually cool and not just kinda boring, like The Volume or de-aging. As a result of so few filmmakers actually engaging with the format over the last decade, we've really only scratched the surface of the narrative and technical possibilities of 3D. When it's at its best, 3D can create immersive, visually stunning experiences that make you want to go back to the theaters just to see it one more time. I don't think 3D is the only thing that's going to be able to save spectacle-driven filmmaking, though I do think it could help. In order for that to happen, though, we need a crop of filmmakers with the innate curiosity, distinct visual styles, and most importantly, artistic autonomy to truly make it come to life in a satisfying fashion. And that brings us to the next problem facing the film industry and the topic for my follow-up video, the problem with corporate-driven filmmaking. And with that, I'll see you next time.